Why this like this fear of the people where they say this like so appears still a very reliable source of energy for the, I would say, for the majority of population, because they, oh, if we don't have gas and coal, then we have blackouts. So we don't have. I just wonder why we are also, as human beings, don't have trust in the new technologies, that will be no blackouts if you, as you say, close and start shut down some coal plants, and the, as you say as well, the capacity will be going down in any case. But we still have this in our mind, and this is what populists are also using, this argument, oh, if the fossils are not there anymore, then we have blackouts, we don't have enough in electricity, we didn't have enough in this and this and this, and the list could go on and on.
Well, so one sad thing that occurred yesterday was that a great man passed, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner for the work he did with Amos Tversky, who passed quite a while ago, for prospect theory. Prospect theory says human beings are not rational economic actors. We fear potential loss more than we value potential gain. So if I say, I'm going to present you the opportunity to lose a bet. If you lose $100. If you win $200. Homo economicus, the rational actor, would say, well, I'm going to take that bet because I have a chance to get $200 and at most I'll lose $100. But a real human being actually values those the same way. We fear loss more than we value gain. We fear the negative more than we value the positive.
But we're also blaming out the health damage that the coal plant's doing. And I mean, you have probably seen, and I don't think it's much better now, become in Delhi, the air pollution.
Yeah.
And we are not still saying, okay, we still are like dragging ourselves behind all the time with all this.
Oh, but that gets into a different cognitive bias. So Tversky and Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast Amos they wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And you really should read Thinking Fast and Slow again, because human beings the way we think is messy. So anything you're used to is low risk because you're familiar with it. As a matter of fact, if you are very familiar with it, you probably feel positively towards it. That's the basis of advertising. Repeat stupid messages and eventually go, oh, I feel thirsty, I must need a Coke, as opposed to, I feel thirsty, I'm going to get a glass of water. So familiarity breeds, as the term goes, familiarity breeds contempt. We're worried about electric car vehicle batteries, even though electric cars catch fire and burn like 100th as often as gasoline cars. But we don't fear getting in our gasoline car. It's just very silly that we are very used to the risks of this. Like, we burn natural gas in our homes. 4,000 homes in the United States burn every year, killing people. Yet people aren't worried about natural gas, but they're worried about electricity and batteries. Right? It's just what we are not familiar with, we are suspicious of. What we're familiar with, we do not fear, even when it is actually much higher risk. And it's much easier, using prospect theory knowledge and this knowledge of human psychology, to sell fear than it is to sell advantages. So the antithetical story is, it's easy to sell fear, and it's easy to convince people that coal and gas are necessary because they're familiar with them.
But this then goes the same argument, and we'll jump again to the hydrogen. I mean, then if people are not familiar with hydrogen, but they're so more open to this, even if it's more dangerous in having it stored in closet where the large urban areas or even the smaller urban areas, and then they are open to this. I mean, this is again kind of populism that is making the people think or believe that this is actually not the same thing as gas, as a natural gas. So why should we trust more electrify everything, rather than saying, oh, I had natural gas before my pipeline, now I have hydrogen coming out. So this is what, from my point of view, this psychological aspect, which I personally don't understand.
Oh yeah, but it's very real because it's easy to sell. I'm going to give you something that's exactly the same as what you had before, but it'll be clean. You won't have to change a thing. That's a really appealing message for a lot of people. And it's a really appealing message for the gas utilities who will cease to exist unless they sell it. Once again, understand motivations. Gas utilities don't exist without hydrogen replacing natural gas or renewable natural gas replacing fossil natural gas. And neither renewable natural gas or hydrogen are replacements that can possibly scale at any cost that anybody's going to be interested in bearing, especially when we have heat pumps. um, Heat pumps are just so much more efficient than burning molecules. But yeah, it's playing into the psychology of it. Now, the nice thing about hydrogen is the Hindenburg provides a nice counterexample. And another example I like to use is Fukushima. You remember Fukushima in 2011? There was a tsunami, killed 300 people or so, and it also caused the backup generators for the Fukushima nuclear plant to go down because they were sited down on the beach because of stupidity in the operations people. They should have sited them uphill, like past the historic marker for a tsunami 300 years earlier that was uphill from the nuclear reactor. There's a litany of errors there. But remember that Fukushima's reactor blew up at one point. It actually exploded. And it exploded because hydrogen was baking off of the nuclear reactions that were going on, and the hydrogen caught fire, ignited, and exploded. When nuclear reactors blow up, it's hydrogen blowing up. You know, it's the statistics on hydrogen in homes are very clear. Right now, best case safety, if you do all the safety stuff, which includes, 10 centimeter holes, vent holes in all rooms with hydrogen appliances to the outside, like holes through the walls. Then, and you have hydrogen detectors, then it's only 4 times riskier than natural gas in homes. I remember this from when I lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, they still use town gas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, up to 50% hydrogen, and carbon monoxide, which kills people. You know, that's why gas ovens used to be a favorite technique for ending one's life, because they were actually getting the carbon monoxide out of the town gas. But in Sao Paulo, the kitchens all had these big holes, just vents. They're holes. They're 10 centimeter diameter holes out to the outside with nothing covering them, because you need that if you've got a lot of hydrogen in a room. And it's still 4 times less safe than natural gas. But it's so easy to tell people, oh, so that means it's easy for people who are countering the disinformation about hydrogen being a replacement with also exploiting the human reaction of fears. Did you know that hydrogen explodes? Right? We can actually the same psychological mechanisms can be used for good or for ill. And so, those of us who are attempting to make sanity prevail and electrification prevail are just as guilty of using psychological hacks like that as the people who are trying to preserve their way of life. The fossil fuel executives and the gas utility executives.
Yeah. Let's move to the price carbon aggressively. I mean, we are saving from the projects that we are doing with in our projects. We are saving the CO2 from, so there we're rather having the applications that are saving CO2, or we install better equipment, and we have also looked at the price of the CO2 equivalent saved from our projects. And we have noticed that the price is between 78 euro to 150 euro per CO2 equivalent. And if you look at the market prices, of course, it's much lower. And I just wonder, how do we price carbon aggressively? What are the mechanisms? The price has been, I mean, in the last year, it hasn't really moved a lot. And how do we get there that the price is actually of the carbon reflects, at least, or is related, in our case, it's related to the investment that we're doing. But what is then the mechanism to do this, and how do we get there?
Sure. So, well, let's start with what carbon pricing is. It's a Pigouvian tax. Pigou was a British economist from the 1920s. He was interested in all the costs that were included in transactions, but especially the ones that weren't included in transactions. Let's say you're a farmer and you've got a field on a river delta that was being fed with nutrients and silt for 1,000 years, and it's rich alluvial soil full of life, and you plant anything and it just shoots up at an amazing rate. Well, that's a positive externality. You happen to be on a piece of land that's got lots of sunshine, amazing fertile soil, and sufficient water that the plants just grow like weeds. That's a positive externality, and we tend to look for places where we can do that. Like a lot of people, when we make coal plants, coal generation, we'll typically see a situation where the coal generator parks the coal generation plant beside the coal mine or really close. So they have the positive externality of digging carbon-rich dirt out of the ground, shove it into a burner, boiling some water, making some steam, making some electricity. And we don't price the positive externality. That's a reduction in their costs, which is okay. This is what you try to do. You always try to maximize your profit, minimize your expenses. Well, the problem is negative externalities are things which provide detriments to others, which are not costed into the transaction. And so Pigou was looking at those and went, there's a whole category of things where they're putting burdens of cost upon society for their personal profit. And interestingly, we can do something about it. We can tax those negative externalities. And society has done that very well with alcohol and tobacco taxes historically. So we've reduced the problems of alcohol and tobacco health harms and harm to others in both cases. And just by pricing them higher, by putting what we call sin taxes on them. So carbon's the same thing. What we want to do is provide a Pigouvian tax upon emissions that cause global warming, greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, refrigerants, stuff like that. And now hydrogen, by the way, it's got an indirect global warming potential of 11 to 12. So that's kind of statement one. So statement two is, what's the right tax? Well, a lot of people now have focused on something called the social cost of carbon. What this is the cost, the marginal cost to society in the world for every additional ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent we emit today. And the social cost of carbon, the EU, for example, right now says the social cost of carbon is about $195. And that is $195. That's the social cost of carbon per Canada's calculation and per the United States calculation. The EU and Canada harmonized their social cost of carbon recently. Now, the EU has its emissions trading scheme, and there's something very interesting that the EU does. It publishes budgetary guidance for the price point, the cost point, to use for pricing carbon in the future under the emissions trading scheme. And so that is their assertion of where they're going to drive the ETS to. So right now, they're at about $150, but in 2030, it's $203. So in 2030, in 6 years, they're saying $203. In 2035, it's 260. In 2040, it's $287 per ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent.
Mhm.
Now, all carbon prices start the same way, mostly, which is they start with a relatively low price and they increase over time. Believe it or not, the United States is actually pricing one of these things. They actually managed to get one in at a federal level and not get it sidelined. At the beginning of this year, they started taxing methane, and they're taxing methane at $900 per US dollars per ton of methane emitted, which turns out to be about $36 per ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent. So it's below the Canadian's carbon price, below the EU ETS, but it's a carbon price. And they're expecting to increase that up to $60 per ton of methane. And that's driving a lot of methane emission reduction in the oil and gas industry efforts. I was facilitating an EU-Canada dialogue on methane abatement a couple of weeks ago as well, literally the same 48 hours as when I was speaking to the Indian conference. And one of the points came out is one of the methane emission abatement service firms is seeing firms in the United States do 400 to 1,200 site projects for methane abatement driven by that new price point. So pricing stuff changes behaviors. But let's briefly get back to this. Does it change human behavior? No, it doesn't. You
No.
and I don't change, but it changes corporate behavior because corporations run on spreadsheets.
But then you say it will be happening automatically. So this price carbon will grow automatically. So there should be now no additional intervention.
Well, it depends on how you structure it. So Canada has a federal carbon price that does have a scheduled increase year after year.
Mm-hmm.
We're now increasing by $15 Canadian, about 10 euros a year, up through 2030. And then 2030 it'll be about $170 Canadian, which is 120 euros, something like that. And so we have what's nice about that is it is regulatory stability and certainty for the organizations inside Canada. They know what they have to budget. They can see a projection. That's nice. We're coming up to an election, of course, where somebody's a populist. Once again, we've been talking about them. Their assertion is they're going to scrap the tax. And there's another piece of cognitive science. People like short, pithy things that are repeated often. Scrap the tax is a simple, straightforward, 3-syllable motto. Poilievre, the populist leader of the federal conservatives right now, is leaning into that sucker like nobody's business. Meanwhile, explaining that the average person, the average family actually gets more rebates from the tax, loses people. I'm paying a tax. I'm not seeing that. So it's hard. So one of the challenges for pricing carbon, one of the challenges is maintaining its salability. That's why even the EU ETS is not at one of the reasons. It's not at the level where it needs to be per the social cost of carbon calculations in the EU. But there's a secondary reason. The EU is a cap and trade system. And a cap and trade system, the price of the unit of carbon dioxide or equivalent goes up if more is being emitted and more firms have to buy credits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's happened, this is one of the weird side effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. The EU and Europe said, oh, we got to stop burning Russian gas. Nord Stream 1 and 2 got blown up. EU pivoted heavily towards building a lot more renewables, a lot more storage, a lot more transmission. It's like radically turned the corner. More efficiency programs, and have substantially cut emissions from the EU as a result. And what that means is a lot fewer people need to buy carbon credits. So the price of carbon on the carbon market EU ETS has dropped. It dropped from a peak of 100 a couple of years ago, when Russian natural gas was being burned like it was, you know, uh, what do they call that? Fake paper in Asian cultures. You're burning joss, I think, to the gods, to give your ancestors money in heaven. And Europe was just burning Russian natural gas like nobody's business, and so lots of carbon credits were being burned, were being bought. But now the market is the cap and trade mechanism with that. And the way that cap and trade mechanisms work is they decrease the cap every year. So they constrain the market to make its number of units that can be bought and sold smaller and smaller every year. So the price per unit goes up even as they decline. What we see is these structural things like this current blip where the EU's ETS has gone down a bit. Now, as the cap reduces year over year, once again, regulatory certainty, the amount of carbon emitted goes down, but the price goes back up. Now, the EU is, in their budgetary guidance, has made it clear they're going to manage the cap to the social cost of carbon. So they're doing it a different way than Canada's doing. It's got more regulatory certainty. And the nice thing about the EU is they're also adding, right now, the EU's ETS doesn't include doesn't include methane or HFCs and stuff like that. It only includes carbon dioxide. It's only a carbon dioxide scheme. But in 2026, they'll include all the rest of the greenhouse gases. It's really unclear to me why the EU, of all people, missed that. But they're correcting that mistake. And that will also drive up the price because methane and hydrofluorocarbons and nitrous oxides are very potent greenhouse gases. And so lots of credits will have to be bought for anybody emitting any of those. So the next piece about this is that the EU is the third largest economy in the world. Second largest if you actually make it Europe and include the non-EU countries like the UK. So it's smaller than the United States, bigger than China if you include all of Europe, just smaller than China if it's just EU. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism also starting to price carbon dioxide or equivalents that are imported into the EU starting in 2026, with oil and gas and a couple of other things added in 2030, start putting a carbon price on the world. So the EU is asserting they've got regulatory certainty around the cap and trade mechanism internally for domestic suppliers. They are trying to decarbonize all aspects to avoid some of those things and incenting the right behaviors in multiple ways. Then they're applying that carbon price to all imports to their economy, which means that China and the United States and Canada and Africa are all of a sudden going to be less competitive if they are not more decarbonized. And so, this is one of the ways that Europe is leading the world on this. It's a brilliant mechanism. And when I speak to people, I say, you really need to look at the budgetary guidance the EU puts out on what to expect from carbon pricing and use that in your business cases. And then
there's a lot of it's a pleasure to hear that you see it positively, but there's also a lot of discussions in negative. How are you going to make that we are not able in Europe be able to receive all the imports that we want, that we need to have, then the prices are going up for the products coming from other countries which are not then following the guidelines. This is another, it goes back again. So we're thinking more about, or I have been actually over the years, I have been able to buy all the cheaper products, and now that at some point of time I will not be able to do this in Europe anymore because of this higher prices due to the carbon taxes.
Well, let's just take an example. I spent some time looking at green hydrogen projects in Northern Africa, in the Maghreb region, a couple of years ago. A European organization engaged me to say, hey, Mike, can you go look at Europe's fixation on making green hydrogen for export to Europe in Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt, those three countries. And I went and looked at those three countries, and I looked at all the projects and stuff like that. You know, it's a colonial energy grab again. It's doomed to fail for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that I said to people, including a conference I spoke at in Tunisia, in Tunisia, the conference was REN Power 2022, Renewable Power 2022 for the Maghreb region. And so one of the things I said is carbon border adjustment mechanism is coming. Keep the green hydrogen and decarbonize your economies. Build green electricity, decarbonize your economies. Because if you decarbonize your economy and stop having to import fossil fuels and stop having to import fossil-derived ammonia fertilizer, then you will be able to continue to export to the EU the food and stuff. Because in many cases, these are countries that are exporting a significant portion of their GDP is agriculture for export to the EU. Mm-hmm. And so the carbon border adjustment mechanism, they need to invest wisely as they can now. And as I said to them bluntly, exploit the European firms and organizations that come to you thinking about green hydrogen, build lots of wind, solar, renewables, and storage, decarbonize your economies with it. And because the hydrogen for energy plays are going to fall apart. And that's starting to happen. It was very interesting. And Morocco, by the way, of all the hydrogen strategies I've read from countries around the world, Morocco's strategy says almost that. We welcome you to come and develop wind, solar, and storage and transmission projects here. We'll use that electricity and green hydrogen here locally. And if there's any left over after that, we will consider exporting it to you.
Yeah.
And so as we look at this,
that will be the correct approach, so that the countries and the government that look at this wisely and say, okay, how we could use this know-how that comes into our country in our favor, and not first serving our interest and then see whatever is then, as you said, left over will be sent to Europe or wherever.
Yeah, but the next piece of this is, one of the ways I describe it is any value chain, economic value chain that a firm engages in, if it has fossil fuels in it, it's going to be uneconomic compared to value chains without fossil fuels. Remember, 50% lower energy requirements with electrified solutions. If you have electric trucks driving your produce around and working your fields and using heat pumps for process heat in food processing, your carbon footprint plummets. Your energy consumption plummets. Your operational costs plummet. Your maintenance costs plummet. You have to get over that capital cost thing. But if you can electrify, you can actually do most things that we value cheaper. And then,
and efficient. So that's why we come to the last point. Why energy efficiency actually didn't have any place in your short list of actions.
India, the one of the
also when we electrify everything and we rebuild and whatever, we still could save electricity. We still could use it wisely with all the measures that you have describing.
Well, let's describe the short list of climate actions that will work is the assertion I make, right? So what I'm focused on, the lens I'm applying, is what will actually reduce carbon emissions. And efficiency by itself doesn't.
It doesn't, no.
Right? So let's take an example out of the UK. They did a study that was published a couple of years ago of 55,000 UK homes which had received funding and assistance to improve their envelopes, to insulate better. And what they found is, they're all burning natural gas, right, for heat. What they found is after a year, they'd had a 7%, 1 year in, there's only a 7% reduction in natural gas. In 2 years, there's only a 2 to 3% reduction. And in 4 years, the natural gas was back to the pre-insulation rates. So this is something called Jevons paradox. Jevons paradox, in many cases, says where there is elasticity of demand, if the cost of something goes down, then the use goes up. And we see induced demand in building new roads. Like if you build a new road to relieve congestion, what happens is in 2 years, you're just as congested, you just have more roads that are congested. Similarly, for a bunch of classes of things, you can induce demand by, like insulation leads to people turning up the heat and leaving their windows open because they're burning the same amount of gas, and that's where their brain is, right? That cost is not onerous, but I'm more comfortable. Similarly with lights, LED lighting is amazing, but now we've got massive amounts of lights everywhere. Like, the amount of light services we consume as Western societies now are extraordinary, and we never turn them off. Like there's roads in the middle, there's parking lots in the middle of nowhere that are empty for 12 hours a day and have bright lights shining down on them all night long because it's dirt cheap. We leave lights on in our office buildings, and birds hit the windows and kill themselves because it's dirt cheap to leave lights on. But that's inducing demand. Whereas before we would have made sure that we turned off our incandescent lights, those burning tungsten filaments we grew up with, or even the fluorescents. Now LEDs, just nobody cares. It's inducing demand. So that's kind of the assertion about efficiency. Efficiency is one of those things where if you make something more efficient, you tend to consume more of what uses. And then if you're burning fossil fuels,
we need to change the behavior. That's again
here's one of my premises.
Which is a complex issue, no?
It is. But here's one of my premises. Here's one of my premises. If a climate solution requires changing human behavior, it's not a solution. If I have to change the way people make decisions, 8 billion of them, in order to actually move the needle. So here's the thing, though. I'm not against efficiency. What I say is the climate solution is electrification and decarbonization of electricity. So that's kind of the two things will actually be a climate problem. Then efficiency is two things. One is, how much do I have to improve the building efficiency in order to make putting a heat pump in and the cost case work, right? There's a low-hanging fruit for building envelope efficiency, as an example. Instead of making them passive homes, you do these 4 things. Like you put in more insulation in these hotspots, you reduce these drafts, you do some tests, you spend 20% of the expense on efficiency, which reduces the operational cost of the heat pump quite a bit, and you can appropriately size the heat pump. So the efficiency enables electrification, but it's a cost for the building unit. One of the ways I describe it is, if a person living in Texas, or let's just pick Minnesota, if a rich person in Minnesota wants to build a gauzy pavilion and crank 100 megawatt hours into their heat pumps to keep themselves comfortable, if the electricity is 0 carbon, do we as a society care? And the answer is yes, but only up to a point. If they want to spend that much money to keep themselves comfortable inefficiently because they haven't made an efficient envelope for their home, the climate still wins. The secondary systemic question, though, is, can we highly inefficient uses means we have to build more electricity generation, storage, and transmission. And so there's a systemic value to efficiency, but it's a second order one. We have to do these things. This is an economic enabler for those things, as opposed to a direct deliverer of climate solutions. And so I'm all for efficiency, but I'm against efficiency without repowering.
True. Agree. Okay, Michael, I think we have reached the end of our conversation, which is extremely interesting, and I wish we could have more time, or we could have continued, because we have not covered all the measures from your short list, or actions from the short list. But thank you very much for joining us and giving us so many valuable insights. And I think what I like it most, that you give a lot of facts and numbers, which are actually missing a lot in all those debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure chatting with you.